All right, hey everyone! Wow, I can't believe that I'm talking to you. This is crazy. It's such an honor to be here at the NonConformist series on practical wealth. My name is John, and I am a crypto explainer journalist, and I'm the founder of the project called the Bitcoin Mint, which is the first ever free and public standard for making Bitcoin really physical, something you can hold in your hand and say, "Hey, this is Bitcoin. This is what Bitcoin looks like, and this is what Bitcoin feels like." It's not a private key that you can peel off and spend later. It's the real deal. And today I want to talk to you about the history of physical Bitcoin and the history of Bitcoin being used as money and what that means for the state and the system of credit that runs our lives. I also want to talk about the importance of being able to cash out of whatever monetary system there is in existence, that whatever state-run system that exists, the importance of being able to hold that money in your hands and define what it means to you, and how you want to use it to enrich your life without the oversight, without the surveillance of the banking institutions, credit issuers, and surveillance capitalists. So about 3 years ago now, I made a couple discoveries that radically changed the way that I see money and Bitcoin. First, I discovered that money is fundamentally a ritual construct. It's not necessarily a solution to the problem of barter or is simply credit, or just a medium of exchange. It goes much deeper than that. It actually shapes the way that we see the world and see our contribution to society and how that plays out in our relationships and how we cooperate with one another. I discovered that this ritual can really go one of two ways, and that our current system does not want you to know that it does not want you to see that money can be viewed radically different than it is today. The second thing I discovered is that hidden within the shared cryptography of the natural world and blockchain was a way to cash Bitcoin into something truly physical. And I discovered that discovery could be used to fundamentally change the way that we view money moving forward. All right, so before I explain how that shared cryptography makes physical Bitcoin possible, let me first explain the two ways that you can fundamentally see money. And we experience this on a day-to-day basis, right? Like you can view money as something that is owed, as credit, something that you earn, or you can view it as mutual aid, as a gift, as something that you freely give and freely receive. I mean, just think about the way that you might help a friend, right? Like say you help a friend build a deck. You could do it for free out of the goodness of your heart, and your friend, in return of your generosity, could give you some cash. Like the cash that doesn't necessarily have to represent what you're owed, but it is a gesture. It is a symbol of reciprocity. Or you could your friend could come to you and ask, "Hey, could I pay you to help me work on my deck?" And you could say, "All right, well, my hourly rate is $50 an hour," and give them an estimate, and then you now have a transaction, and you have something that the state is very interested in. They want to know when that money, that credit changes hands, and you have to report it as income. Versus when you just help a friend out and they happen to just give you some money as a gift, you don't have to report that, right? And so we can intuitively see that at the individual level, there's these two fundamental ways to view money. But this is also at the collective level. And this is something that has been systematically erased from our collective history, because we, for the most part, really only view money as credit at the collective level. For example, when you look at bride price customs, which are the earliest prototypes for money itself, you find that money exists on a sliding scale from credit to mutual aid. And the bride price is simply something that a potential groom would give to the bride's family to solidify a marriage in a tribe or stateless society. The famous ethnographer grouped these customs into three categories. The first category is what she called the equal bride wealth model. And in this custom, the groom, the husband-to-be, would meet with the tribal elders to come up with a gift, something that represented his love and his family's appreciation to the bride's family for this union. And it was not a measure of the groom's worth necessarily, but it was simply a symbol of cooperation and unity. And then so on for the second model, she called this one the service model, the bride service model. And this one's is on the middle of the spectrum. Instead of meeting the tribal elders to come up with this symbol of thankfulness, instead, and this is typically in hunter-gatherer tribes, the groom would earn his wife's approval through labor. And this would typically look like a year-long commitment to work with the bride's family before getting married. You actually kind of see this in the Bible with Joseph marrying Rachel, not Joseph, sorry, Jacob marrying Rachel and Leah, where he had to work 7 years before he could earn his marriage with Rachel. And of course, the story goes that the father tricked him into marrying Leah, her twin, her sister, and then he had to work another 7 years to also marry Rachel. But anyways, in this model, the gift is really a symbol of credit. It's something that you have to pay in order to earn this unity. And the last model is what she called the unequal bride wealth model. And this one is a little bit more extreme. And there isn't really an idea of consent involved for the bride itself. It's usually in these systems, what happens is the groom's family views the bride price as a symbol of status. It's something that gives them recognition in the social unit, that they are more important, that they are more worthy of trust. And so what they do is they measure different goods, like prestigious items like precious metals and horses, and they try to outdo one another in order to get that recognition, right? So for example, if you are a well-to-do family in a stateless society that uses this model, you would want to give the bride's family something like a horse, right? To show everyone of how great you are, and if all you had was like these ceremonial beads, you wouldn't have the same prestige, you wouldn't have the same recognition in society, and you wouldn't be able to command the same trust and authority that someone in a high status gift would give. And the thing with the bride price is that whatever society elects, whatever custom that they use, kind of informs the way that tribe, that group, that community then views the bride price, views that commodity or good as money going forward, right? So if it's in an unequal system, right, like where when you look through history, this eventually evolved to silver, right? Silver became the primary measure of status in these societies. Then silver would continue to be used as a symbol of credit more so than this gift-giving symbol that you see in the earlier, more nomadic stateless societies. So what does this mean? Well, it demonstrates that the decision to view and use money as credit is really, it's arbitrary, it's a choice, it's a ritual decision, right? And the more you use money as credit, the more distrust and competition and the more toxic your collective unit becomes. And the more that the people in charge, the people that benefit from that credit, don't want you to see that. The more power they accrue, they do not want things to change, right? And so this, as you'll see, will become an analogy for where we are today as a society that is wholly dependent on credit and viewing money as credit. But at the end of the day, it's an illusion. We can just as easily see money as a gift instead of something that is owed and something that is earned. And we can do this at the individual level, just so at the collective. We just need better rituals. And so this brings us to our next slide here, nature's cryptography. What is this shared cryptography between blockchain and nature that makes physical Bitcoin possible? Well, I discovered this one day at the park when I was thinking about just ways to make Bitcoin physical. It's something I've always been curious about. And I realized that there was nothing in Bitcoin, the consensus mechanism, the blockchain, that actually gives the unit of account, the actual asset, any definition. And there's nothing that says what it can't be as well. So it's totally a blank slate. All you have are these unique identifiers, right? It's basically like an address book where every Bitcoin address represents the location of an undefined asset. And so someone might look at that and say, well, Bitcoin's nothing. Okay, I'll just go about our day. But clearly Bitcoin is not nothing. If you're a philosopher, you would intuitively understand that actually represents true potentiality. The blockchain is really a blank slate, and each address, the Bitcoin at each address represents an undisclosed asset at an undisclosed location, and embedded in that system is a way to reveal that location. And so nature works in the same way that blockchains work, right? Everything in existence has a unique identifier. There is patterns everywhere that can't be replicated naturally. And the easiest, most straightforward example of that is wood grain, right? It's impossible to recreate from nature, right? The exact same pattern, a wood grain pattern, right? I mean, you can 3D print something, but you can't actually recreate the molecular structure of a tree that grew and experienced time and material change in the way that each block of wood represents, right? And so what I did was I simply developed a protocol that uses sift edge detection technology. It's the same technology used to scan your thumb to identify yourself, right? Like, so, it creates a feature vector that represents the visual pattern, right? And so what I did was I used that technology to translate visual patterns into spend-only Bitcoin addresses. Like, they're final destination addresses, right? And I recorded, cataloged that protocol to Bitcoin itself. So it's publicly available for anyone to use and test. And so the way that you make Bitcoin physical is that you send this undisclosed asset to an address that represents that is deterministically derived, represents something in the physical world that can't be counterfeited, that can't be recreated. And that's exactly what this is. And so if you look at it, on it, I'll probably show a close-up here. It says 50 bits of Bitcoin rendered as aid. And then on the back, it says the bits of Bitcoin at this address is forever bound and revealed in the natural wood grain pattern of this physical coin. And so there's a little QR code in the back. You scan it, it takes you to this address on a blockchain explorer. I'm using the Ordinals Explorer, where I included a little extra data that acts as like a physical Bitcoin receipt that basically says, hey, I use this Bitcoin was sent to this final destination address and is revealed in the object that the address was derived from. And so now it's like a true address book, right? The blockchain is a true address book where you can send Bitcoin to a final destination that you can hold and feel and say, hey, this is Bitcoin. So that's how it works. I get a lot of questions about counterfeits, right? How can this system protect against counterfeiting? And it's really a sliding scale, right? Because at the end of the day, it's impossible to counterfeit, right? You can't recreate this exact wood, but you can make something that looks like it, right? And so it all depends on how you want to prove that it is real wood. And there's multiple techniques and there's multiple ways to go about that. But for now, this is really still just this is the real deal, but it's just one of the earliest iterations. So what's really cool about this is that anyone can do it, right? Anyone can make physical Bitcoin, and anyone can make it into art. Actually, this poster, the whole reason why I set up this talk here is an example of that. And so the question is, what does Bitcoin made physical really mean for this current illusion of credit, the system of credit that we live in today? Right? What is making this physical offer people who care about freedom and liberty and censorship resistance? Well, there's a lot to go through. And so for the second half of this talk, I want to explain why the state is so fundamentally opposed to physical money and cash, and why the banks and credit issuers are so threatened by your ability to hold their credit, their symbol of credit, outside of their system. And I want to explain how this machine, this system of credit, will likely try and use Bitcoin to reinforce this illusion and enforce a completely cashless society that is totally dependent on credit. And I want to explain how this could be a tool against that. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about the current state of cash in the economy today. It seems like every day more and more businesses are refusing to accept cash, right? You go to maybe I don't want to say where I live. I go down the street and every coffee shop it doesn't accept cash, and every small business, it seems, from personal experience, it seems like cash is on the way out. But when you look at the actual numbers, there is a reason for this. This is a systematic attempt to slowly phase cash out of the economy. So if you just look at the past 5 years, businesses accepting cash dropped from 80% in 2021 to 60% in 2024. When you look at cash transactions, those dropped from 20% of all transactions in 2021 to 14%. And so when you look at the reason for this general decline, you have to go to the biggest pain points for small businesses and retailers, and it's the cost to manage cash. And so there's multiple contributing factors that have increased that cost over the past 5 years in a very acute way, right? So if you just kind of look at it in a broad level, and this is just very top level, you know, the cost to manage cash has rose from 9% or 9.1% of the total cash you take in to about 12% of total cash you take in. Now, of course, when you think about it, like cash has always been a costly part of the business, right? Like it's always going to cost you more as a business to count the cash, to process it, to transfer it to a bank, to store it, than it is to just accept digital payments. Like there is the 3% fee the credit card is charged, but that 3% fee and whatever other fees, they've never really equaled what it actually costs to take in cash, unless you are a cash only business and you're doing other things to take advantage of that, right? So businesses have always felt that pain point, right? But they have always accepted cash because there is a social expectation of that, right? Well, that really changed during COVID. You started to see this real push to justify, right, going cashless, where businesses, you know, a lot of organizations like the World Economic Forum and the Better Than Cash Alliance and the NIH, in coordination with them, really push this narrative that you shouldn't use cash because there is a chance that you could catch COVID from it. Now, there was no threat to this at all, and the NIH admits that. But you know, in the flurry of everything, this message got out, and people were afraid to use cash. And even if people knew there wasn't really this type of fear, there's still this social pressure to just acknowledge that people are trying to do the right thing, right? And so all of a sudden, businesses who are already paying a lot to manage their cash because of all these rising costs, because of the rising cost of labor, because of the rising cost of fuel to transfer cash from their business to a secure bank deposit, since they've already been experiencing these factors, this gave people the excuse to just factor it out of their business altogether. And then on top of that, during that time, banks really started to charge businesses more fees for actually just depositing cash. The thing that banks were meant to do from the beginning was just hold your money for you. They started to charge people for that. And it really was, you know, no extra cost to the bank, right? It's very minimal. This was a very psychological, targeted attempt to just give businesses the push to just go contactless, just accept the trend of the, you know, society. Now, there were some pockets of resistance here and there, but the general trend has followed suit, and we're starting to see more and more businesses just do that. Okay, so let's review the magic of cash, the magic of the physical human-to-human exchange, right? So first off, the thing that offers the individual is it is totally private, right? Anytime that you use your credit card, right, that data is cataloged and used against you in so many different ways, right? That it's shipped off, bought and sold by all these different parties wanting to better understand your behavior and manipulate you, right? And then it's also used to track your credit score and just regulate you in society, right? And secondly, going back to my example with the friend who is helping his neighbor with his deck, the individual exchange gives you the opportunity to ritually redefine money for these purposes, right? Like when you give someone cash, when you pay someone cash and you either give it as a gift or you give it to someone in need, it reinforces a narrative about what cash is used for. And you can't really do that with digital payments, right? That ritual doesn't exist. Not having something physical there to remind you of what was given and what you gave, it doesn't really help create a more high trust society. And it doesn't condition us in the same way that physical cash does. Also, when you carry cash, you're more likely to spend it for local purposes, right? You're more likely to think local. It actually subtly changes the way that you see your community. But lastly, physical, and this is probably the most important factor here that I want to hammer at, is it limits the power and reach of credit printers, right? The people, the banks, the credit issuers who decide who gets credit and who doesn't, right? That interbanking system is totally reliant on those people holding the slips of credit, right? And anytime that you hold it and use it and redefine it in ways that are outside of their control, it is like a vote in the system. It helps the regular people keep these powers in check. Okay, so why does the physical exchange of cash really threaten the banking system? And this really gets to a big misconception that most people have about banks, the Federal Reserve, and money printing in general. Most people assume that the Federal Reserve is the one who prints all the money in the economy. But what actually happens, the money in your bank account was actually most likely printed from a bank somewhere in the system lending money, right? So when you look at a bank's balance sheet here, you'll see that it's broken into two sides, right? On the right side, you have the bank's liabilities. You have what the bank owes itself, which is the equity, and other people, which is loans that it takes from the banks, and of course deposits, right? You might think, well, hold on, I thought the deposits were the assets, the money you give the bank. It's like, no, it's actually a loan. You are loaning your money to the bank, but it's in the bank's possession, right? On the left side is the asset, which is the money the bank lends out, and it also includes treasuries and anything that generates interest, which then funnels back to the equity. Okay, so but the way this works, right, is the loan side is effectively new money, and what all the bank has to do at the end of the day is just keep this balance sheet balanced, right? So anytime that a deposit comes in, that's money that the bank can now print on the other side of the balance sheet as a loan. And so once you print that money, it's now in circulation, right? And it didn't exist before. And so just because the bank's counting on that money coming back to them, it's effectively doubling the amount of money in circulation just by adding it to that balance sheet. It's doubling the amount of credit, right? And so when you think of credit, money as credit, and it's a representation of your collective credit to, or your share of credit to the collective. And what they're effectively doing is they're fudging the numbers, right? It's not that they're just deflating or debasing the money when they overlend and increase the total supply. They're reappropriating how it's distributed. And so the way that they keep this system in check is they lend to each other, right? So they have to, every bank's have to follow these rules. The balance sheet has to, both sides have to be equal at the end of the day. And so when it's not equal, so if they don't have enough deposits on the right side, they just go and to their neighboring bank, or they go to the Fed and they borrow money from the Fed at like an overnight rate. And then they settle their account and they're good, right? And so as long as money stays in this system, they're able to perpetually just create more and more credit and redistribute it just as they like, as long as it's in their account, right? So when you take out a loan, all the bank does is they just print it on the balance sheet, right? They just say, okay, this is new money, and now it's on your bank account. So, and then if you want to withdraw that loan, well, you're most likely going to pay it for something, right? Use it to pay for a house or a car or something that's going to go to another bank account, right? And so when that money goes to another bank account, that increased the right side of their balance sheet, which then enables them to then create more money, right? And so that money can then be used to lend back to the bank to account for the deficit, right? So it's oversimplification, but as long as everything's connected in the banking system, it's very easy to perpetuate this cycle. And the banks are really only threatened when you withdraw it into something that you have full custody over and they do not have oversight into, right? That is what threatens this printing machine. And that's why they're willing to raise the deposit fees to just nudge businesses to get the cash out of the system. Now, of course, this system of credit printing can't openly acknowledge that it is threatened by your ability to withdraw its credit into your own custody, right? Like if it acknowledged that, then it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, just like the bank collapses of the Great Depression, right? This whole system is a magic ritual intended to make you think that the money in your bank account is yours to withdraw and do with as you please, when in fact it's not. It's the banks to use and redistribute as they please. In fact, the banks were so threatened by people taking custody of their own money during the Great Depression that they convinced the federal government to force its own citizens to sell their gold for dollars. And in turn, the government then repriced the dollar from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce, which the government then used to buy or inject the banking system with that liquidity that would have otherwise gone to the American people at a time where they needed it much more than the banks did. And when you combine that with the way that the federal government went after Bernard van Nothaus for minting his own private money called the Liberty Dollar, and the way that the government has systematically targeted privacy coin developers like the Tornado Cash crypto mixer and the Samurai Wallet developers, which was another type of mixer. When you see the way that the government has gone after those people, it's very clear that private custody, anything that takes money out of the banking system into something that cannot be surveilled and tracked is the primary threat to this illusion of credit. And so the history of physical Bitcoin is one of the most interesting examples of this. It all started when Gavin Andresen proposed the idea for printing Bitcoins on the Bitcoin Talk forum. If I remember correctly, his idea was that if you attached some opcode or metadata to a Bitcoin transaction that says that the transaction was printed, you could then print that transaction ID as a QR code with some type of way of redeeming. It was unclear, but his idea really sparked a lot of conversation of people that felt like there should be a physical representation of Bitcoin. And so about a few months after that, someone responded to this thread with a physical Bitcoin that they had made out of brass and epoxy. It had no real connection to the blockchain, but seeing something physical with the Bitcoin logo reignited this conversation, and it sparked a whole bunch of different approaches to this. And so one person, who went by the username Cassius, came up with the idea of attaching the private key to an address on the back of a coin, which was then encrypted or sealed but with a holographic sticker, so that when you handed the coin to someone, if that sticker was unbroken, you could trust that the only person who had access to the key was the original manufacturer. And if that manufacturer had a good reputation, you could carry that coin with confidence that no one was going to spend the Bitcoin at the address. And so when Cassius, whose real name was Mike Cadwell, introduced that idea, someone else ran with it. His name was Douglas Filgerson, and he took his holographic seal idea and used it to manufacture something called bit bills. And so my theory is that he thought that if he just was the first to market, he would really corner the physical Bitcoin industry. But Mike had been thinking of this, and he came out with his version a month or so after, which was actually a physical coin. And his I remember his post on the Bitcoin Talk forum said that he had created the first ever physical Bitcoin coin, which I think had a much bigger impact on the psychology of accepting this as something that you could call Bitcoin, right? And so his post got a lot more attention, and his project got a lot more attention than bit bills. And you can see this because in March 2013, you started to see newspapers using his physical Bitcoin, his Cassius coins, which he called them after his Bitcoin Talk forum username, as the image for Bitcoin itself in all of their articles. And when you look at the Google Trends from that time, you can see that Cassius coins far outperformed bit bills. So 2013 was a big year for Cassius coins. Sales went through the roof, and Bitcoin Talk users were complaining that they weren't getting their coins in time. But at the peak of his sales and at the peak of Bitcoin's price, FinCEN issued Caldwell a letter stating that he was running an unregistered money transmitting business. This sent shockwaves through the Bitcoin community. One Reddit user wrote that, "I wonder how long before this sort of jackbooted thuggery dries up the US Bitcoin economy." Many others made comparisons to the Liberty Dollar, citing fears that the government wouldn't tolerate Bitcoin as private money. And they were right in one sense, but wrong in the other. They didn't go after Bitcoin itself. They just went after tools that encourage people to use Bitcoin as money, as Bitcoin as cash. And there's good reason to think that FinCEN timed this letter to crash the Bitcoin price and cast a shadow on physical Bitcoin in general. Because when you look at the regulations they used to justify their letter, they had updated it 10 months prior. So they had all this time to alert Caldwell. But they chose this specific date, in the mid-December, when the Bitcoin price was at all-time highs. It saw the biggest price increase in its history, and it was making news headlines. That's when they chose to alert the community that this was on their radar. And I think there's a good case to make that the news was this was the news that ultimately sent Bitcoin into a 3-year bear market after that. People often argue that it was the Fed shutting down the Silk Road marketplace or the collapse of Mt. Gox that triggered that 3-year bear market. But the news of the Silk Road had already broke a few months prior to the all-time high, and Mt. Gox didn't actually collapse until February of next year. And so this the closure of Cassius coins had a catastrophic effect on the physical Bitcoin industry. It delegitimized the model for a couple of reasons. It showed that it couldn't withstand government censorship and that it highlighted the dependency on a central manufacturer. There are a few people who tried to succeed after Caldwell's Cassius coins, but they all turned out to be scams, right? Because you got to think, like, the type of people who want to enter this market after FinCEN are less reputable figures, right? And so, for example, the Adeline Mint, right? That came out maybe just a few months or maybe a year after Cassius coins. That turned out to be a scam where one of the founders ran off with everyone's private keys. And then Titan Mint is another example of this, where the founder just was MIA. He used like a two-factor authentication method and used it to basically steal everyone's funds. There wasn't like hard proof, but people were able to put two and two together that this guy just disappeared and stole everyone's Bitcoin. And so now 10 years later, the only real physical Bitcoin model to remain are these elaborate cold storage devices that basically work by sealing the private key on a hard drive, right? And the way that you seal and unseal it is you tap your phone to see if there's if the slot or address that the Bitcoin is stored at is sealed and cryptographically proven to not have any access, right? And then once you unseal it, you can then spend it, right? So it's the same idea as the physical holographic seal, but rather it's hard coded onto the device itself. And the big drawback with this is that it kind of defeats the whole purpose of it being a non-surveillable method of exchanging Bitcoin, right? Because you're not sending Bitcoin to someone to a different address, but there's still a mechanical intermediation in the process that can gather data and share it with third parties who want to leverage that for their own purposes. And so it's this state-approved version of physical Bitcoin. And I think at the end of the day, the fallout from FinCEN's letter demonstrated that none of these coins are really physical Bitcoin, right? They're just elaborate private key storage models that isn't really Bitcoin itself, but rather just gives you access to Bitcoin on the blockchain. So when you look at the actual justification that FinCEN used in targeting Caldwell as a money transmitter, you find that that justification could have been equally applied to Bitcoin miners. In the regulation, it says a person that creates units of convertible virtual currency and sells those units to another person for real currency or the equivalent is engaged in transmission to another location and is a money transmitter. So in this updated guidance that they had made in March of 2013, that could have equally applied to Bitcoin miners. Miners create, in a sense, the virtual units of currency. They are what introduce the currency into the ecosystem by validating and using proof of work to earn the block reward, and then they sell it at some point, right? And so that could have applied, and there's a reason why many people were sincerely afraid that FinCEN was going to target the whole Bitcoin ecosystem. But it wasn't until after the collapse of physical Bitcoin and the collapse of Bitcoin price that FinCEN later updated the regs to exclude miners from this potential of being considered a money transmitter. So by that time, the damage had already been done. It was clear that FinCEN's intention from the beginning was to delegitimize the idea of physical Bitcoin, but more specifically, the idea of Bitcoin being used as money itself. They likely understood that if this project were permitted to continue with the viral adoption and success that it had, that this physical incarnation of Bitcoin would actually compete with the dollar. And it would be a way for people to exit the system, something that the banks cannot oversee and regulate. And so it's curious that FinCEN was not threatened by the digital version of Bitcoin. And as we'll see, it is because that Bitcoin is totally traceable, and this is useful for the IRS, and it's useful for criminal investigators, anyone who wants to track criminal activity, and it is very useful for the state and the credit issuers to, in the future, reprice the dollar to a virtual standard, something that they can track and regulate in a way that they weren't able to do with a gold-backed standard. Okay, so the question becomes, why would the creditor class be interested in a Bitcoin-backed monetary system? And why is the government interested in keeping Bitcoin around? For this next section, I want to explain the ritual of interest and how it's used to ultimately back the state's measure of credit, right? Because that's the goal at the end of the day. The state wants you interested in its measure of credit. It was the same goal when the state priced the dollar to gold. It's why they call these laws acts, right? They were a ritual performance intended to reach a consensus and keep you interested in the state's measure of credit. So when the government went off the gold standard, they just adopted a new ritual to keep your interest, right? But instead of pricing the dollar to gold with Congress, the Fed meets to set the price or the rate of dollars and more dollars in the future. It's what we call interest rates. And so there are two things that are ultimately backing the US dollar here. And the first is Treasury's ability to make its interest payments, right? To service its debt. And then the second is your interest in state debt, your ability, your willingness to buy state debt and other nations' willingness to buy state debt. And so the way the Fed helps regulate this system is that when the government and the economy need a stimulus, they need help in order to fund its operations and ultimately service its debt, the Fed will add U.S. treasuries to its balance sheet. They'll buy U.S. debt. And what that does is it lowers interest rates and funds the government, and then also funds the economy, injects the economy with cash to help keep things moving along, right? And when the economy needs to tighten and inflation needs to cool, the Federal Reserve will sell those treasuries, right? And which will then increase the interest rates, which will then attract more people into buying government debt, which will then suck that money away from other assets in the economy and help cool things down, right? And so this system works relatively well for the banking system, for keeping people interested in the state's measure of credit. But there is a huge problem when the government is the interest rates and the cost to service this debt gets too high, right? And so that's where we currently are in the economy. The cost to service the debt has ballooned to a large majority of the budget. It now costs more than the U.S. Defense Department and is nearing the same price of what it costs Medicaid. And so the government now needs that stimulus. They need the Federal Reserve to buy up their debt so they can roll it over at a lower interest rate. But the economy doesn't need that, right? And so there's this divergence of needs. And so the economy is still overheating, right? And prices are too high. And so if the Fed buys government debt in order to lower interest rates, then inflation will rise too quickly. And so we're at this point where investors are very concerned that if the Fed has to come in and save the day again, like it did in 2008, then there will be too much money, too much liquidity in the system, and the dollar might hyperinflate. And so, which will then cause a catastrophic cycle, right? Where people will not want to buy government debt because that measure of credit is decreasing at a rate too fast for the interest rates to make up for the loss in value, right? And so there will be a flight from the dollar, and this will cause a catastrophic crisis that will ultimately lead to the government needing to reprice the dollar in the same way that it did in 1933 when there was a flight of capital from the system, a flight of capital from the banks. So this scenario makes Bitcoin a very attractive solution because the government won't be able to reprice the dollar to gold like it did in 1933, right? Because first it would have to reprice it at an astronomically high price in order to fund its operations. And second, there's too much physical gold outside of its circulation to be able to honor whatever that redemption price is, and in a reliable and consistent way, right? And so the difference with the Great Depression in 1933 is that it was relatively easy to confiscate its citizens' gold and cut people out from the broader gold market, right? Because we weren't living in the global economy that we are today. Whereas now they have to account for all this whole interconnected ecosystem, this economy and other nation states who are also accumulating gold and have competing interests with the US government. So ultimately, the state will need to use a neutral reserve asset that it can better control and regulate. And Bitcoin is the most ideal candidate for this scenario. Its supply is fully transparent and it's global, right? No power or state has any jurisdiction over it. And it's the first of its kind, right? So there's no other cryptocurrency or digital asset that can surpass it, right? In the same way that silver can never really surpass the psychology that gold has. So it has this natural appeal to it. But secondly, the way that Bitcoin is tracked enables the government to set two prices for Bitcoin. It allows them to set a price for all the whitelisted coins, all of the at all the addresses that are approved for holding and exchanging it for very specific reasons, and set a negative rate for altcoins that are used for in arenas and in ways that the government doesn't like, right? And so this two-scale system allows them to regulate the demand and redemption for Bitcoin $2 in a way that doesn't actually require that they confiscate it like they did gold, right? It uses a clever repricing trick that is totally dependent on Bitcoin's surveillability. And so in this future scenario, the state's not going to offer you a physical self-custody version of its credit, right? Like cash will not exist. They need you in their closed system, right? Where machines will be responsible for tracking everything you do and ensuring that you remain interested in its measure of credit and its system of credit, right? And so this system will continue to erode human trust and make us totally dependent on machines and intermediating forces in order to cooperate as a society. We'll become more dependent on AI, we'll become more dependent on automation, we'll become dependent on universal basic income, because no one will be able to interact with and trust one another because of this machine state ritual. And so this is why physical Bitcoin is so important, because it guarantees an off-ramp from this future and current machine state, right? Because physical Bitcoin with the Bitcoin Mint is totally untraceable and, more importantly, uncensorable. Unlike the previous versions of physical Bitcoin, there isn't a central manufacturer. So there isn't a central attack vector for the state to shut down, right? This standard for making Bitcoin physical is forever preserved on Bitcoin itself. So you can't get rid of it without getting rid of Bitcoin, right? Every server that runs a node has that standard recorded to it, right? And so that will make it nearly impossible for the government to try and censor anyone who tries to access it. So what's cool about the minting standard being inscribed to the Bitcoin blockchain is, yes, it's uncensorable, but it also doesn't require the approval or consensus of the Bitcoin network to work. All you need is the person in front of you to see the revelation of Bitcoin in the physical object. They don't need a third party to run the algorithm for them. They can copy the code, run it on their own device or computer, and check to see if the pattern represented in the coin generates the address on the blockchain. Once they see that for themselves, they know two things. They know that there is no way to move that Bitcoin to another address, and that there is no other physical object that could represent the permanent destination of that Bitcoin. And so this creates an opportunity for people in the machine state to use money the way they see fit, right? To cash it out. And in a scenario where you're restricted on how you can use money, how you can use state credit the way that you want in the system, you can take that freedom back. And there's no way that they can steal that from you. And it encourages this collective redefinition of money itself as aid. And this is the most profound aspect of this, because when people are confronted by a common enemy and they're given the chance to exit that system, they can begin to see true wealth in the relationships and in the mutual trust of their community, right? And so you can use money as a gift, as a symbol of your reciprocity and a symbol of your commitment to strengthen your own community. And that's what I'm doing in my own community. A group of us meet regularly to share art, discuss ideas, and share physical Bitcoin in person outside of the machine state, outside of Twitter and sort of the surveillance capitalism network. And so if you want to learn more about that, follow my Substack at the Bitcoin Mint Press. It's where we share a regular zine and newsletter about all of the topics that we discuss and that mean the most to us. And if you want to learn more about how to mint your own Bitcoin with our minting standard, check out the website, thebitcoinmint.com. And there you can find more information on how to purchase some of the commemorative physical Bitcoin that I've minted for this project. So thanks again for your time. It's been such a pleasure talking to you all, and I hope you have a great day.